Hey, what's up guys? Since there's so much space in between these book reviews, I decided to make another video, and since I finished Blood Communion, I want to do a video rating my least favorite to my favorite book in the Vampire Chronicles series. So that's going to be including the 13 main stories, not Vittorio or the Pandora, that are the tales of the new vampires. I won't include that, but I thought for fun it would help fill the air in between book reviews. Anyway guys, check out my least favorite to favorite books of the Anne Rice, the Vampire Chronicles series. And just as a disclaimer, and possibly an enticer, this is a list that, unlike any other, I'm going to have my personal favorites may clash with the traditional ranking of the 13 books thus far. So it'll be interesting to see where these books land on the list from worst to best in my opinion, and I'll give you the reasons. But if you want more in-depth review, please check out my individual video reviews of the books, and I'll explain in more detail of what I like or don't like about the book. So in my opinion, the worst in the series has to be Blood Canticle. I wasn't really impressed with the story, needless to say, for it to be the bottom of the list. Big surprise, right? The reasons, in short, why I didn't like it is that it just felt really out of touch when it comes to the rest of the series. I described in my review that it felt like you took the Vampire Chronicles and turned it into Rambo. It felt like a old classical Vietnam kind of movie where you had the Taltos that was captured and Lestat, Quinn, and Mona go on a rescue mission and go to rescue this creature, the Taltos. That's the basic plot of Blood Canticle, and it felt more like an epilogue. Wasn't really impressed. It felt out of place and just didn't feel like the Vampire Chronicles at all. I mean, even reading the story in my mind, I could just picture Lestat and the crew donning black, all black with little ski caps, with black face paint on to be like camouflage. Just felt out of place and was not impressed with Blood Canticle. And I know that this was a time when Anne Rice had a lot of issues. Her husband had just died. It may have affected the writing, I don't know, but definitely this would make the bottom of the list for me. So, this kind of switched over time. Over time, this book I've started to dislike more, actually, just on reflection and thinking about it. So Prince Lestat in the realms of Atlantis introduced aliens into the series, and the Replomoids, I do believe they're called, and which really are probably the least interesting parts about this novel and the following novel, Blood Communion. Anytime it involves the Replomoids and Atlantis and the aliens, kind of loses me. Again, it has kind of suffers of the opinion of not really fitting into the Vampire Chronicles, really. And it's just lack of interest of aliens being part of this, and the whole story of who Amel is and his backstory of what the spirit and what created the vampires and all that. It started off with an interesting idea. I know Anne Rice had been working on an idea in her head about Atlantis for a long time, and that idea eventually turned into the next Vampire Chronicles book, but it really just didn't fit into the series, and the longer time goes, the less I look fondly at Prince Lestat in the realms of Atlantis. For the Replomoids, if nothing else. Really not interesting when it comes to being characters for this series especially. The Tale of the Body Thief is the story of Lestat once again becoming human, and what it was like for him to once again be mortal. Maybe it isn't as fun as he thought it would be to experience what it's like for us Sure, you have fun, you can have sex again, but also comes pneumonia, which Lestat learns the hard way. So I don't understand how this was going to be a film. With that said, for those that don't know, Tell the Body Thief was after Queen of the Damned film came out, a possible movie that was worked on by Christopher Rice. And as a book length, it barely really carries enough for a whole story. I mean, the whole niche of the story is Lestat's human again. And it does have interesting parts in it, such as David Talbot with the Talamasca and Raglan James. So it has memorable characters. I don't even have to look up references to remember these characters. It obviously has some good points. And Lestat being human again. And Louis, Lestat going to Louis to be a vampire once he's human, and Louis doesn't want to because his dream is to be human again himself. So it does have parts, but as a story, I don't know if it really holds up it definitely doesn't hold up as my favorite in the series. And it's kind of a story that is stretched to book length that could have been a little shorter, even though it does have some good parts to it. So that's why I would make it further to the bottom, towards the bottom of my list. It's interesting, but definitely not a favorite. So the next book would be The Vampire Mind, which, like the Prince Lestat and the Runs of Atlantis, had the opposite effect. As time has passed, I've actually grown to appreciate this book more. In my video review for The Vampire Armand, I didn't really think too highly of it, mainly because of all the gay erotica that was in the novel. Not because I'm against gay erotica or anything like that, but it's just not my cup of tea. But since then, I have been reading the Sleeping Beauty series more. And so I'm more accustomed to that style of writing. So whenever I first read that book, The Vampire Mind, I was just turned off by how much erotica was in it. But now that I've been actually reading the Sleeping Beauty series, it's really not so bad looking back on it. Still, when you come to the Vampire Chronicles, you don't expect so much like literal erotica being put into it. So that could turn some people off. With that said, though, it did have some good parts about the history of Armand, about how he became a vampire, how he didn't found the Theater of the Vampires, but how he became the leader, and so forth, that was spoken of in Interview of the Vampires. So it gives some good backstory for a vampire that should have been dead at the end of Memnoch. And for you guys that know, this whole book, Vampire Armand, actually restarted the series. It was supposed to end with Memnoch the Devil, but Anne Rice saw people at Memnoch signings wearing Armand Lives t-shirts, and that's what spawned the idea for this book. So I'm thankful in a way of the book, and I do look more kindly to it now, but it still is not my favorite in this series. So Merrick is about Merrick Mayfair, who is, as it sounds, related to the Mayfair witches. So Louis gets in contact with her so that he may speak again to Claudia, is the basic idea. So that's what makes this book really good, is Louis gets questions answered that he has always wanted to ask Claudia since her death. And Claudia returns as a ghostly form and speaks with Merrick's help and answers questions that Louis wanted answered. So we find out more about their relationship. We find out, did Claudia really truly really love or care about Louis? Or was it all a plot and ploy just to manipulate this little naive, sweet vampire, possibly? So we learn more about that relationship, which is why I really enjoyed this book. I did. And yeah, in short, that's why it would make this list right here. In what was to be the end of the series, Memnoch the Devil definitely left a punch that still haunts people to this day. Lestat gets to meet the devil, or so we think, and he goes through heaven and hell. Literally, he loses an eye. He gets to meet Jesus and is tempted to drink Jesus' blood. So there's a lot of controversy that was written with this book. It was very much bringing up questions. And then what happens to Armand really set the fans on fire. Not to be a pun, but it had a lot of shocking moments for spiritual reasons, plus just literary reasons for the characters we love. And it literally just about left Lestat comatose by the end of the story. So it's very much a good read. Possibly, I don't think I like it as much, as you can tell, as some, because I didn't list it as my number one book favorite of the series. And Prince Lestat and the Realms of Atlantis water this down a little bit for me because of what we find out in that novel, which makes me dislike Realms of Atlantis a little more because it kind of pulled the punch from what this actually really had. So the next one for me would be Queen of the Damned. The Vampire Chronicles anthology is what I like to call it, because each chapter is just about another vampire. Every chapter, it feels like it jumps to another story of another vampire because all the vampires are burning up. So it's going to tell their experience of what's going on as Queen Akasha rises. Now, it is interesting why she rises for vampire rockstar Lestat, and how she wants to destroy all of mankind, literally the males, if she could, and make it a whole female planet. It's interesting. I really did enjoy the Queen of the Damned. This also introduces how, at the time, the origin of the vampire that would be even furthermore explored in later novels. But I can't rank this really low because it introduced a really cool villain. And it also introduced the lore of the vampires, of who they were, or of what we thought at the time. So it had a lot going for it. Really interesting book for sure. So Blood Communion is next. And it would make the list because, to me, this was a nice bow to this series. As of 2020 so far, this has been the latest book. And the ending was a nice ending. If Anne chooses to end it, I think that it ended very nicely right here. What started kind of with the story from Envy the Vampire, or if nothing else from Prince Lestat till now, it wraps up the story in a very nice way. So why it made it even lower than in my top 4 or 5 is because there were a few things I didn't really enjoy about this book. How a vampire was killed off just to progress the story, literally in one chapter. Kidnapped vampires, you never think are dead, because these are solid vampires that have been in the series for books, and if they had been killed off the way that it's teased, then it would have completely, fans would have had an uproar about that, so you knew it wasn't going to happen. But overall, it was a really nice story. I really enjoyed Blood Communion. And yeah, so here we go to the next. After the disaster in my eyes of Blood CANTICLE, Anne Rice returned again with Prince Lestat. And I really enjoyed this book. It kind of brought the series up to the 21st century, introduced vampire doctors and cell phones and podcasts, and doctors who were able to turn vampires, give them a formula that kind of let them have sex and children. So a lot of interesting things happened in Prince Lestat. The vampire community had been in chaos and an uproar, and it was up to our favorite vampire to bring it all in line. And it had a lot of action. It had introduced the son of Lestat. So Prince Lestat, excellent book. It was a lot of fun, and it made me want to know more. And it also served as a catch-up book for those that had possibly never read any of the Anne Rice books. It kind of gave a brief summary of what had happened. So for new and old fans alike, it was just a really fun book that I still really look back on very fondly. Blood and Gold. Blood and Gold is the classic story of Marius, and he tells his story of how he became a vampire to Thorn, who is one of my favorites, a Viking vampire. And the whole story behind Marius, how he became a vampire with the god of the grove biting him, being made by druids to be a druid god. And it basically tells his point of view of what we were already told in the Vampire ARMAND, that novel. So it's kind of like how the Vampire Lestat is to Interview the Vampire, Blood and Gold is to the book The Vampire ARMAND. And overall, it is a classic book that fans agree is one of the best, and I can definitely see it. There's a lot of action, there's a lot of love, there's a lot of interest. There's just overall really interesting things to be said and done about Blood and Gold. I can't say enough, and it definitely deserves its spot right here. The novel that started it all, Interview with a Vampire, makes it at this spot right here. Maybe a little surprising that that would not be my number one pick for my favorite, but that's a good thing. That means that Anne wrote better stories after her original novel, which is usually, hopefully, if you're a good author, a typical thing, and it's true with her. So Interview the Vampire, just to sum it up, I enjoyed it. I fell in love with the movie, and that's what made me want to read the Vampire Chronicles, and I enjoyed the book just as much. It's just not my favorite, but I would say that if you love the movie, if you've never read any of the series, definitely check out the book Interview the Vampire. And it does have some differences, but a lot of it is the same as the movie. So I love the book. It's definitely in the top 3, but just not my favorite. So what are my top 2? We're going to find out in a second. I told you this list is going to be controversial because this is not the typical way it's supposed to work for Vampire Chronicles worst of favorite list. So number 2 is the Vampire Lestat. And why I like the Vampire Lestat is because it's Interview with the Vampire from Lestat's point of view. It also introduces him as the rock star, and it just tells an overall story of how he was a prince, the wolf killer in France, and his relationship with his mother Gabrielle and Nicholas, and how the only thing Lestat ever wanted to be was to go to France to be a theater actor and a musician. So it's just an overall really good story, and it made, I always call it in my review of how the Vampire Lestat turned one book, Interview the Vampire, into a universe. It became the Anne Rice universe thanks to this novel, and it is amazing. And number 1 is a shocker to a lot of people, but it is my own personal taste, and that is Blackwood Farm. This is a book that has gained a lot of popularity more in recent years, but was really not liked back in the day, and by some fans still not liked now. And I didn't know what to think when I first opened this book, because I finally got to Blackwood Farm, and it was a pretty thick book, if memory serves right, and I'd heard mixed things about it, and I just read it, and I fell in love. The idea of a ghost haunting what would be a vampire, and so you'd have a vampire ghost story, and it had Quinn, my favorite vampire, in this story. He was introduced, and how he became a vampire, how he lived on Blackwood Farm, and he would see an old abandoned mansion across the swamps, and he would take his boat with lamp and go across the swamps to investigate this old abandoned mansion that had a light on, even though it's supposed to be abandoned. It was just an overall really fun story for me. I loved the characters. I loved Goblin, the ghost that was haunting Quinn. It was overall just a really amazing book. Like I said, this is going to be the controversial part of the review, if nothing else, of my list, because I say this tops the series, and I'm very much aware that that's a minority opinion, but in my opinion, my favorite of all time is Blackwood Farm. And if you want to hear more of a detailed reason, check out my reviews on that specific book to hear my point of view from it more. Alright guys, so I hope you guys liked my review, my list of worst to best when it comes to the Vampire Chronicles. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Like I said, it is a different list for sure when it comes to the rankings, because this is very much a different ranking than most people would give it, probably. And I just wanted to do this for fun and to fill the air in between the book reviews. So I am reading the 3rd book in the Sleeping Beauty trilogy, or the quadrilogy now, isn't it? And once I finish reading that, I'm going to give my review of the third Sleeping Beauty book. And I hope you guys like these reviews, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.